Good afternoon, everybody, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Ashley Fortune. I would like to welcome you to today's broadcast of the webinar series, National Climate Change Wildlife Science Center's 2013 Climate Change Science and Management. This series is a partnership between the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. On the phone, we also have Emily Fort, Data and Information Coordinator at the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, who will be facilitating the questions from our live audience in Reston at the end of the presentation. Today's broadcast will be presented by Shawn Carter and will be focusing on providing the science for natural and cultural resource adaptation to climate change. Emily will introduce our speaker in just a minute, but first I'd like to remind you of a few logistical details. For all of those that are joining us on the phone, you're on a global mute, and you will continue to be so for the duration of the presentation. At the end, we will give you an opportunity to ask questions. We will be taking a couple questions first from our live audience in Reston, and then we'll also take your questions over the phone. Emily, would you please introduce our speaker?
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to have the honor to introduce Shawn. Shawn is the Senior Scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, headquartered in Reston, Virginia. He manages the science and research activities at the center, which include synthesis of climate impacts to plant and animal populations, quantifying species and habitat vulnerability, and linking various model projections to populations or ecosystems of interest. He also works with federal and academic researchers at the Department of Interior's Climate Science Centers to coordinate regional to national climate science priorities and to stimulate new research that informs adaptation planning by land managers. Shawn has degrees from Cornell, Virginia Tech, and SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and his research interests include ecological monitoring and assessment, forest ecology, and species-habitat relationships. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shawn.
Great. Thank you. So I put the presentation up. Hopefully it's displaying okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. It's really great to be here, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the first annual webinar of our hopefully long-term series in partnership with the National Conservation Training Center. The purpose of this webinar is to really showcase the kinds of work and projects that our climate science centers and the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center here at USGS are sponsoring. It's really meant to be kind of a smorgasbord of information for you all to glean from, and we use this webinar series as a way to highlight projects and also provide you all with resources and tools to find additional information, because there's certainly a lot to talk about. With that, I'll get started. Today, what I want to talk a little bit about is kind of an overview of where we've come as a program and also where we're headed into the future, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So this is a messy diagram, but really my purpose today is to really try and provide that broad brush for all of you to talk about where the CSCs have started, where they're going, a little bit about our national center, the type of work that we sponsor, how that complements the CSC body of work that's out there on the landscape now. And then I want to contrast two areas of emphasis that we have, one on infrastructure and capacity building and one on science assessment and research. And what I'll be doing is going through individual examples in each one of those emphasis areas, but by no means is this exhaustive. So I'm happy to entertain questions, obviously, at the end, and to provide people additional resources and guidance. So let's get started. What I want to talk about first is just a little bit of history. And for those of you that have been following the CSC enterprise for a while, and for those of you familiar with the U.S. Geological Survey, you might realize that before the CSCs and landscape conservation cooperatives came to be, there were notions of these regional hubs and landscape adaptation units and strategic habitat conservation initiatives around on the landscape within the Department of Interior. And really what happened later is In 2009, the Secretary of Interior really identified key priorities, one of them being climate change, and repurposed some existing initiatives into what we now consider the National Climate Change Wildlife Science Center, which was asked to stand up the climate science centers, of which there are 8 around the country, and also established the landscape conservation cooperatives, which are being led by predominantly by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's 22 of those around the landscape. Today I'm not going to talk too much about that background. I'm not going to focus on the LCCs per se. I just want people to realize that really this is a DOI initiative that moving since 2009 forward. And in 2010, the first 3 climate science centers were established in Alaska, in the Southeast, and in the Northwest. These were established through a competitive process by and large, and what really is a model is it's a consortium-based model where you have a host university, the science center is established with a cooperative agreement, and they're really working, university and federal agencies in partnership to establish this integrated science center. We have a total of 8. In 2011, we established 2 additional ones. And then in 2012, last year, we established our last 3 CSCs. I'm happy to say that now in 7 of our 8 CSCs, we have full-time permanent federal directors, and they all are in the process of moving forward and implementing research on the ground. So we're very proud of that accomplishment. I'm not going to focus on the individual CSCs during this talk, but again, I'm happy to provide additional information, and I'll also point you to where you can find additional information about the CSCs in a minute. So the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, as I mentioned, was tasked with establishing the CSCs, and it has a slightly different purpose. Really, what we're focused on here at U.S. Geological Survey is providing the tools and information to managers to really cope with climate change and climate impacts predominantly on fish and wildlife and their habitats and federal lands. But really we talk about all resources that are being impacted and providing tools for managers to cope with that. And our governance is, as I mentioned, we're USGS Center. We're the only center that's solely led by the USGS in terms of its organizational structure, and we're housed within the Climate and Land Use Mission Area. We also have programmatic linkages with other elements of the U.S. Geological Survey, especially those in research and development, landscape, land change science, apologize for that, and then also the ecosystems mission area. Our center primarily gets guidance from the Department of Interior as well as a newly established Federal Advisory Committee, the Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science. My role at the center as senior scientist is to work with that committee primarily through an ad hoc science subcommittee, and that FAC basically works with us to establish broad priorities and make sure that we're fulfilling the need that the community at large identifies we need to meet. A little history on the climate science centers. As I mentioned, these are DOI climate science centers. They're really focusing on several aspects of integrated science related to climate change impacts, primarily integrated modeling, scenario and forecast development, synthesis, landscape level monitoring and assessment, and really providing a forum. Probably one of the most significant roles is providing a forum for research and resource managers to collaborate and talk and discuss what their needs are related to climate change. Each CSC uses a stakeholder-driven regional science agenda to define their research priorities, and we place a special emphasis on sharing data and information. The key characteristics I think that are worthy of highlighting for the climate science centers is that they really are this university federal cooperative meant to access a broad suite of research capabilities depending on the needs identified by the stakeholders. The priorities are set by working in conjunction with the landscape conservation cooperatives and other stakeholders and managers, and we really try and emphasize the landscape scale inference with dealing with climate impacts. Being university-based, there's also a special emphasis placed on training of students. I'll mention that a little bit more in a second. This is just a map showing the overall footprint of the climate science centers. They cover 8 broad geographic regions, and as I mentioned, these are have affiliated institutions, a consortium-based model within each of these geographies. So no CSC region has the same complement of universities, and each is really tailored to meet the needs of that particular region. Also, we recognize that each CSC region has what we call fuzzy boundaries. They really are not strictly wedded to any socio-political boundaries, or are really meant to work as appropriate across their geographies. One role that the National Center has in working with the CSCs is to focus on synthesis and intercomparison and promote data exchange and information exchange among the different CSCs around the country. I just want to highlight one point with the CSCs. Each CSC is established with a host agreement, and predominantly that agreement establishes resources for training undergrads and grads. And right now, through our 8 climate science centers, we're sponsoring almost 60 grads or postgrads through this enterprise. So we're really placing an emphasis on getting interdisciplinary science done, getting students trained that hopefully will be working with us and working with managers in the future to really tackle the challenges posed by climate change. Just a little bit on how the CSCs are run is slightly different than the National Center. Each climate science center has a stakeholder advisory committee. It's chaired by a USGS regional director, and then the membership of all of these, what we call SACs, is executive level representations of the stakeholder community. And what the SAC is really meant to do for the CSCs is to provide broad guidance on priorities of research and also leverage scientific assets in each region. As was mentioned, I won't spend much time on it, but each climate science center has a regional science agenda that really outlines the specific needs in terms of research for each CSC region. It provides a blueprint for the type of work that each CSC will do. Those agendas are informed by the scientific community, embedded through the managers, and it really provides the basis for identifying short-term annual priorities. It also is the basis for establishing funding calls. Right now, the CSCs have a call out, as many of you may know, asking for statements of interest in terms of research priorities that would be identified under those science agendas. Subsequent SOIs that are highlighted or invited for proposals will potentially be funded under this RFP process that we're currently funding. Okay, so now with that background, I just want to spend some time talking a little bit about the type of work that we are trying to facilitate here at the National Center. I'm going to use examples that are sponsored both by NCCWSC, the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, as well as work that's sponsored by the CSCs themselves. I really want these bins that I'm going to be talking about in infrastructure and science assessment are really meant to be complementary, and I think they're pretty consistently used by both the national level office as well as the regionally based CSCs. And as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on infrastructure and capacity building. And when I think of infrastructure and capacity building, I think of kind of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. So hopefully this is kind of what we're instilling in that cadre of scientists that are being trained right now. And science assessment and research, really, I think kind of the fundamental purpose that people identify as CSC, the fundamental role that they're providing. And as all of you know, this is complicated stuff, so it's in and of itself, just conducting the research is a daunting task. So moving into the capacity building component, I just want to highlight briefly one of the main things that we focus on, and Emily, who introduced me, is largely tasked with this, as well as data and IT within our shop, but really focusing on communication and dissemination of information. And I just want to briefly highlight that this webinar series in and of itself is meant to really facilitate this communication process. Each webinar is recorded. It's provided on our website. The web link there is at the bottom, as well as transcripts of each webinar and links to all of the associated manuscripts and publications and information products associated with all the projects that we highlight. In addition, you can also reach information for all of our climate science centers from this page as well, each of them having their own suites of projects that you can search through. In a moment, I'll talk a little bit more about how you can, some ways that we have for actually trolling through the projects that are funded. So on data and IT, another key element that we provide is really this idea of data exchange and infrastructure. The National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center was charged with standing up the CSCs. The CSCs are really meant to provide, in addition to regionally based information for decisions, they're really meant to provide a national capability, a national network that can be utilized. And part of the basis for that is this data infrastructure. One thing I'd like to highlight from the get-go is a science base, which is something that we're using to serve as a catalog and repository for all the information being generated by projects through the CSCs and by NCWSC. It's really meant to serve as an integrator using web services and allows people to look across CSCs to harvest information about projects and where the associated data and information are housed. This is just a screenshot of what you can expect from a science-based catalog query, in this case looking for downscaling. I'm sure most of you have used different data catalogs in the past. This just highlights the fact that you can use different filters. It gives you a geographic footprint of the data that are being presented, as well as brief descriptions of the kind of information available. And then for each individual project, you get a data display that has a project summary, as well as some associated metadata. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's an awful lot of information being generated from the work that we're sponsoring. Right now alone, last year we sponsored, I think, approximately 96 projects, each generating tools and information for managers. So it's important to be able to identify where those tools and where those data reside. And this is just a screenshot showing that for one of our projects on cheatgrass die-off. And then finally, just a data schema, just showing kind of the overall conceptual framework for how we're approaching data management. Really trying to work with the stakeholders to identify what data are out there and being generated, leveraging products like ScienceBase, focusing on catalog and publication and serving as a repository, as well as larger Geo Data Portal, in this case, larger applications allow subsetting of very large data sets focused on downscale information, for example. And then using those suites of tools, really allowing the distribution of information via web portals, porting to ArcGIS, and also different kinds of analysis portals that our stakeholders are using, like Databasin, an HD catchment tool, for example, as well as desktop applications. Both of these products use open source technology and are really meant to be provide standards and a standard framework that promote data exchange among the land management agencies. I want to highlight education and training, again, as a component of this capacity building. And I think being university-based, it's a very, perhaps intangible, but very significant and lofty goal of our enterprise. And I just want to highlight two things that are happening on the ground among our climate science centers. One being this concept of summer school. These are sponsored trainings for students that are based in a certain geography. And this example is from Alaska, and focused on certain technical aspects related to climate change. In this case, focusing on climate downscaling and modeling for the Alaska region. This provides an opportunity not only for students to exchange ideas and get to know one another, but to really get very specific training in the set of skills that they need. And then there's broader, more experiential kind of learning, in this case sponsored by the Northwest Climate Science Center, that's really looking at similar things in terms of really getting a cadre of students together, being able to share their ideas, compare their projects, and also learn about the local systems and the climate impacts that are expected in those systems. And then I also want to touch on really evaluating performance. Are we doing what we've set out to do through this enterprise? And part of this is just really, it's just really hard to do when you're kind of building the car as you're trying to drive it. But one project that we're working on right now, and is something that is being played out in other climate science centers, is this concept of social network analysis. And the way that we, at least initially, identify are we doing what we're supposed to be doing is surveying the broad suite of stakeholders, finding what kind of climate information they're using currently, identifying what they expect out of a climate science center, and really trying to evaluate, are we making a difference? When we revisit the same set of stakeholders, have we changed how they get information, how they trust information, and how they use information? So now I'm moving on from capacity building to really looking at one of the primary roles of a national center, and that's the idea of conducting national level synthesis. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the specific examples, but one recent national synthesis that our center pulled off was under the auspices of the National Climate Assessment. We conducted technical input as well as helped author a chapter in the NCA on biodiversity and also ecosystems and ecosystem services and associated climate impacts. And what we did is we convened experts from around the country and really tried to identify the state of the knowledge in terms of what impacts are expected to biodiversity based on the literature and based on the research being conducted. Some of the primary, just to highlight some of the primary findings, was this concept of really looking at observed shifts in time and space for species. So changes in geographical ranges and distributions, and actually finding that phenological changes are occurring faster than previously thought. And also that some of the rates of warming were faster in the ocean than on land. Other examples include perhaps a little bit more evidence for looking at projected distribution shifts poleward or upward in elevation, but also finding surprises, and that there wasn't necessarily a continuous, consistent pattern among species. Biotic interactions, for example, can often complicate the expected response when you're looking at climate change. And then also this idea of kind of not knowing what you don't know, the idea of novel interactions and assemblages, climate change resulting in transitions of existing ecosystems, and also the creation of novel climates, and not having information from the historical record for which to base any kind of predictions or models. And then also trying to identify which species are meant to, in the short term, are going to be at greatest risk versus other species that actually might benefit from climate change. This concept of winners and losers, and trying to understand what are the physiological responses and underlying mechanisms that drive species-level response to climate change. And then I'll just end on another finding that this concept of the speed at which the species are able to move and adapt to climate change versus how quickly it's occurring, and looking at work that has been done and work that is ongoing, and trying to evaluate this idea of adaptive capacity, the velocity of climate change. Moving on to vulnerability assessment, another key element of what climate science centers are tasked with doing. I just want to highlight one specific project that was coordinated through the National Center, and this was led by one of our staff, Laura Thompson, and it was trying to evaluate the one of the Secretary of Interior's high priority performance goals, to basically look at vulnerability for the Department of Interior. And there was a data call that went out that really asked what kind of work are bureaus within the Department of Interior doing that address these key focal resources and also might include these focal threats. A very ambitious data call, and one of the key guides that also came out around this time was provided a little bit of a template for how you might evaluate vulnerability or conduct vulnerability assessments using these concepts of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity that has since kind of made it into the vernacular when we talk about vulnerability assessments. So what we did is go through this data call and really try recognizing that vulnerability assessments are a key component of really adaptation planning and adaptive management. As we trolled through the 403 projects that came back from this data call, the different bureaus are listed on the top in terms of the number of vulnerability assessments that were reported. And we tried to tease apart which vulnerability assessments were really trying to evaluate exposure, sensitivity, and try to also account for adaptive capacity. In other words, which vulnerability assessments that were being done by bureaus at that time really adhered to this concept of vulnerability assessment. And what we found is that it was actually very hard post hoc to go through and identify projects that had all of the necessary components for really providing information that you would need in a complete vulnerability assessment. Part of this was definitional. Part of this was just lack of information. So I think this was very enlightening in that we were able to demonstrate that while there's a lot of work in vulnerability assessment, this idea of really defining what a vulnerability assessment is meant to do, how it addresses sensitivity, exposure, and includes adaptive capacity are very important considerations. And what we're going forward trying to do is provide guidance in terms of really what would a regional level vulnerability assessment need to include. And this is just a brief example of one project on looking at impacts to coho salmon in the Chutna watershed of Alaska, and through a discussion with that particular individual running the vulnerability assessment, it turns out that that individual hadn't actually explicitly considered all the components of what a vulnerability assessment would include, but through discussion, it turns out that actually the key components needed for understanding exposure, sensitivity, and some measure of what adaptive capacity might be were addressed. So I think this is a good example of, I guess, first off, needing to define vulnerability initially in very clear terms, but also the value of having discussions with managers to see what their needs are, what their management challenges are, and to see if the research being conducted can fit into that concept. Another element is really what I'm calling linking people to decisions and linking the researchers and the research products to those decisions as well. I want to highlight an example in the North Central Climate Science Center that looks at integrated modeling, which a lot of our CSCs do, but really tries to do it from an end-to-end concept. And this is taking basically ecological response models, linking those to some downscaled climate information, and driving them all the way into some management objectives in a very real-time way. This is called the Revamp Project in the vernacular. And that, I should point out that web link is, contains more project information. This uses a program called VizTrails. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but Jeff Morissette, the director at the North Central Climate Science Center, is sponsoring this work, is also published on this particular aspect of VizTrails. The key element I'd like to highlight is that what this does is it allows for integrated modeling, but it makes it in a very transparent and repeatable fashion. And one of the things VizTrails does is really provides a comprehensive provenance infrastructure so that you can have detailed information about how models are linked, how they're coupled, and how those outputs are generated. And in this example, VizTrails is being used to look at cheatgrass habitat in Rocky Mountain National Park. And I just want to highlight that this is a real-time kind of simulation where you can actually compare different scenarios with the managers and look at what the expected outcomes would be under this certain modeling framework. I think the key element to highlight here through this revamp approach is that it focuses on real-time what-if scenarios working with managers. So in other words, the ecosystem models or the models being integrated are done so, they're parameterized on-site. The trade-offs are evaluated in real time through a transparent process. And working with the managers, you can actually play out what-if scenarios with the existing data. And I think it's very useful. It underscores the need for data to run some of these scenarios. Okay, I want to touch a little bit on integrated modeling, scenarios, and projections. This is a very large component of the research portfolio in many of our CSCs. This example is drawn from Alaska. Steve Gray is our director there at that Climate Science Center. And I'd like to highlight this example because to me it really demonstrates an integrated approach to understanding, in this case, glacial systems. And there's different, the green triangles are meant to indicate in situ data. The projected impacts actually run all the way from the glaciers themselves, and in this case they're comparing maritime glaciers with inland glaciers, all the way through what the discharge differences in discharge might be, what the influences to streams might be, and also the influences to the maritime system in terms of impact to trawl catches and stream fish. And just to go into a little bit more detail, in this case actually comparing the differences in glaciers, it was interesting in that the project, when you talk about the managers and what they want out of the glacier project, they actually didn't care too much about changes in mass balance of the glaciers themselves. What they actually cared about was the difference in runoff potential and what that runoff was going to be doing in terms of impacting the fisheries or impacting the streams, changes in water temperature, changes in nutrient concentration. As I mentioned, this is one example out of our Alaska CSC, and Steve would be happy to provide more information. I tried to briefly cover some of the research topics that we deal with at the regional level and at the national level. I also want to just highlight moving forward what kind of work you can expect out of the CSCs and out of the National Center. Dealing with infrastructure and capacity building, we're placing a very strong emphasis on structured decision-making or decision analysis frameworks for really linking managers to the specific management objectives that they're trying to address with the research that's available. I just want to highlight that these are really two different things. All of our CSCs have believe in doing work that's applied and has decision support elements. This idea of decision analysis, I think, is slightly different, and it's vital when we talk about the integrated kind of science that we need working with managers to drill it into management decisions. The information and data management is another key component of where we're going to be investing moving forward. Look for federated searches and also the ability to, in real time, exchange the wide range of geospatial data available related to downscaling and other kind of climate work. Education and training, this idea of workshops and boot camps among the CSCs will continue. We're also hoping to sponsor national symposia for students that will be theme-based and will highlight the kind of work that these all of these students are conducting. And then lastly, this idea of evaluation. Our next steps are really looking at the research products generated by CSCs and trying to identify meaningful performance measures for our CSCs under those research agendas, giving managers what they need to inform adaptation action. It's easier said than done, but it's definitely something that we feel is meaningful for our enterprise to evaluate. And then secondly, regarding research and assessment, the National Center is going to be continuing to sponsor national level synthesis. Right now we're engaged with people from NOAA and some other agencies in really trying to kick off a national assessment of what ecological drought means when we talk about climate impacts. It has some definitional challenges as well as some research challenges, but ecological drought or drought in general is something that has been identified by all of our CSC stakeholders as important, and really trying to move out in front on this idea of ecological drought is something that we'd like to take on at the National Center. Vulnerability assessments, as I mentioned, what we really need to be promoting is a framework for regional climate impact, and we're going to be moving forward with that based on the lessons learned from this recent assessment. Socio-ecological impacts is kind of linking decision makers and stakeholders to the information being provided. We have a multi-CSC project that we're hoping to sponsor soon that's going to be working with First Americans to look at traditional ecological knowledge and how we can incorporate that in a better understanding of climate impacts and associated scenarios. And then lastly, on this integrated modeling, what we're finding in a lot of the body of work being conducted by CSCs is this idea of trying to do intercomparisons for particular regions or habitats based on the existing scenarios that are available. And I can, as most of you know, it is not often the case that you get nice, clean, repeatable results through using different GCMs or emission scenarios. But I think that it's important to be working with managers and be transparent in the thought process involved with generating some of these scenarios and allowing for these intercomparisons to really be teaching tools to show the pros and cons of using downscaling to generate scenarios for managers to use, and also, I think, underscore the limitations of the state of the science right now. And I think I ended on time, and that is my last slide, so I'm happy to answer questions.
Excellent presentation, Shawn. Thanks so much. The plan is we're going to take a couple of questions here in the room at USGS in Reston, and then we'll toss it to Ashley, who's going to facilitate for the phone, and we'll just go back and forth. So I'll start with here in the room. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Looks like they are all completely clear. So, Ashley, take it away.
They're all sleeping. For those on the phone, they're all sleeping.
Ashley, take it away with the phone.
All right, Shawn, I'm just going to ask you, because we went with the share an application, can you bring everybody back to the main screen by pressing the stop sharing button? Excellent, thank you. All right, everybody on the phone, if you have a question, you can either type it in the chat box, or you can press the raise hand icon that is located between the participant list and the chat box. We do have one from Patrick Christ. It seems like the CSCs are fairly closed. How can organizations that are not existing university partners get involved?
That's a fair question. The CSCs right now, I would say probably the best way to get involved is to be working with the CSC directors in indicating your interest in working with the CSC. Right now, the RFP process that is ongoing is open to university consortium members and USGS science centers, but we really are trying to promote integrated science and research, and there are opportunities for other individuals to not only be part of that funding process, but to also be engaged in other ways. I would say depending on the level of involvement and interest in the region that you're in, the CSC directors, all of which I'm happy to provide later, or you can reach from the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center webpage. Those would be your first stop, I think, for reaching out.
All right. We do have a phone question from John O'Leary. John, you can ask your question. Remember to unmute your own phone and then take off the global mute by pressing *6.
Have I unmuted?
You are.
Thank you. Thank you, Shawn. This is a great presentation. It was a great opportunity to understand what's going on with the National Center. And it's really, I was pleased to see how you're looking at adaptive capacity and understand the importance of it. And I just wanted to say that Claudia Mengele and I from the National Academies of Science are going to have a session at the National Adaptation Forum to try and we've put together a working group to try and look more into what adaptive capacity is. So it's something that's attracted our attention. We're trying to look at it, but I'm glad to see that it's on your agenda as well. So thank you.
Thank you for your comment, John. I guess I will mention one, certainly a big issue, and I'm really glad that you're going to be taking that up, and I think that forum is going to be a wonderful opportunity to have those discussions. One thing that we've been dabbling in at our center, and it came out of the technical input that I mentioned with the national assessment, was this idea of kind of the genetic basis for adaptive capacity and trying to get some empirical data to really tease apart what the empirical or what the genetic components are for being able to adapt.
I think that's where we're focused on too, is all these various plasticities, these transgenerational and phenotypic plasticity, and there seems to be a lot of literature out there on it, but it hasn't made its way into the climate change community, and I think that's sort of one of the difficulties, and that's part of what we want to accomplish, because it's not just a matter for doing vulnerability assessments, but I think in terms of listing species and some of these climate niche models and things, there's a lot of people, and us resource managers, I work for a state fish and wildlife agency, we need to understand it if we're going to not waste our time and spend our money wisely in trying to do adaptation strategies. So it's critically important now.
Agreed. I'm glad that you're taking part in that.
Come on along.
Emily, do you have any questions from there?
No, I think we can go ahead with the phone.
Alrighty. We have a text chat question from Gregor Sherman. Can you tell us a bit about how the approach to setting up individual CSCs has changed as the 8 have been set up over the past years? What lessons have we learned thus far?
Oh, great. Thank you for the questions. Very good question. I guess I'll briefly touch on the approach. The approach for establishing those climate science centers, other than Alaska, which was non-competitively established because it really was a very limited pool from the university community, there was a competition that was held for consortia. Actually, there was just a competition held for proposals for universities to propose basically capabilities for dealing with the needs outlined by the Department of Interior for dealing with climate impacts. So during a course of 3 years, that process was organized by USGS, but it was really a competitive process that was run by all of the DOI bureaus. Proposals were evaluated by that interagency group of members, and then the CSC proposals that were identified were then awarded to that host university through a cooperative agreement. So I guess that's in very broad terms how those were established. In terms of lessons learned, I think that's another very good question. And as with any competitive process, each region has different capabilities just by virtue of the universities included. And also, we're not talking about a large amount of money. Right now, each CSC is really meant to have at least half of its money go out the door in terms of research dollars. We would love these to be fully funded at about $4 million, but right now they're generally less than half of that. So there's not a lot of money to run these, and by definition, you can't have an exhaustive consortium participating just because it's not a good use of resources. So there is a right-sizing component here that I think is played out in each region, which is why we have different numbers of universities. And then also I'll just touch on that each CSC has different skills and capabilities as a result of that competition. So what you will find is, or what we are finding is that CSCs around the country are making investments and really coming into their own in different skill sets based on that consortium membership, as well as the complement of federal research centers that they have at their disposal. So I guess the lesson, just to end, the lesson learned would be, I think that this, any process is you learn as you go. I think what we're faced with now is really trying to engineer a process for conducting research efficiently, and also bringing in new skill sets and new partners along the way as those needs are better defined by the stakeholders. I mentioned we were building the cars, we were driving it, and that really was the case through this whole process.
Thank you, Shawn. And Emily, if anybody has a question there, just after each question, if you want to jump in, feel free.
I will, but so far you're clear.
All righty. We have another question on our text chat from Catherine Thomas. It says, I want to make sure that I understand the scope of ScienceBase in the Geo Data Portal. These can be used to archive data sets developed through CSC projects?
So Shawn's looking at me, so I think that means, Emily, please help answer this question. So just to expand, ScienceBase is a tool that was developed actually by the Fort Collins Science Center, part of USGS, and it's broader than just the Climate Science Center. So it's in use by a lot of different groups and a lot of different parts of USGS, and it also goes beyond USGS for several initiatives. So we sort of, when we were looking how to invest and how to start capacity, said, well, let's not start from scratch. Let's try to leverage what's out there, and ScienceBase was a great tool for that, and it will be kind of the major focus of where we try to put all of the CSC-funded data and deliverables. That's not to say that they might also go in other repositories or catalogs as people want to get the word out. We just want to make sure there's at least one copy there. And the Geo Data Portal was another initiative that we started funding, and it's really trying to make it a little bit easier to get at some of these large model data sets. So it is very complementary. The team that works on it and the team that works on ScienceBase work closely together and they can transfer information between them. So the Geo Data Portal is just kind of naturally a good fit for some of these really big model data sets. So that's where some of those are going, and everything else is pretty much going on ScienceBase, but we're making sure that information is cross-linked and shared between the two. So I hope that answers the question.
And we do have two follow-up questions concerning that. They're both from Aranzazu Lasuran. Is ScienceBase only for projects being funded by the CSCs? And could you query projects in ScienceBase by CSCs only?
So, no and yes. So ScienceBase is used by more than just the CSCs. So it's certainly the CSCs, we've sort of adopted it. Individual projects that CSCs are funding could have a closed area for working data as they're working on their project, and then they can make it public through ScienceBase. So that's an option. Other tools, many other groups are using ScienceBase, so it's broader than us, and it kind of allows us an opportunity to leverage work that other folks are interested in and work kind of more broadly together. And then, what was the second question again?
And anyone, can they pull CSC information?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so each CSC, sorry, I zoomed on that. Each CSC is kind of defined as its own community. So whenever you do a search, you can search within that community or then within all of ScienceBase or within the CSC sort of enterprise, which would include the National Center and all 8 CSCs. So you can kind of decide how you want to get that. And we're also making all that available via our website, the National Center website and the DOI Climate Science Center websites display all of that sort of project information by CSC, and that's all driven from ScienceBase automatically. So if we add a report or we add a publication or we add a data set to ScienceBase, it shows up on our website immediately. So it's a really good way to kind of make that more available.
Thanks, Emily.
Sure.
We have a phone question from Tony Lynn Morelli. Tony, go ahead with your question.
Thanks. Yeah, Emily, actually have one more follow-up on that, which is whether ScienceBase or the Geo Data Portal can formally link up with LCC projects.
Sure. Actually, in many cases, a lot of the LCCs have also been using ScienceBase, and in fact, sometimes they've kind of rebranded it into something called LC Map. So several LCCs, including the North Pacific and the Great Northern and the Great Plains, are using ScienceBase actively. There's also a project that Fish and Wildlife Service and the LCCs are working on, and I'm participating, called the Integrated Data Management Network, that's looking at being able to provide both science-based capabilities as well as any other LCC tools and sort of be able to integrate and share information across all of those. So if LCCs are interested, I know the ScienceBase team is really excited and willing to help them think about how they might use it and evaluate it as an option.
That's great to hear. So I'm the program manager of the Northeast Climate Science Center, and that's one of the things our 7 LCCs are interested in, is making sure our projects are syncing up and not, replicating. So that seems like a good way to do it.
I agree.
So we'll be in touch.
Sounds great.
And speaking of linking up, we have a question from Virginia Kelly that says, how does the CSC program interface with other federal departments and agencies, such as the USDA Forest Service?
It's a good question. I think we link up on several levels. At the national level, that Federal Advisory Committee that I mentioned has agency representation. So they are on the ground floor in terms of giving us their needs and evaluating our progress through that Federal Advisory Committee process. At the CSC level, that is driven by kind of these stakeholder advisory committees. We do have agency participation from NOAA, from U.S. Forest Service, from EPA, kind of depending on the CSC needs. I will say that in the Northeast, for example, the Forest Service is directly engaged, actually as one of the principal investigators on the cooperative agreement. So very direct engagement of the Forest Service R&D program in that case in the CSC activities. We also see Forest Service being included a lot more in some of the project work and collaborations in the Southeast as well as the North Central.
Thank you. We have one more question coming from Patricia Tillman. For the pie chart on the 403 vulnerability assessments, could you clarify the information presented? Does it represent what agency said about the information they used, the CSC's assessment of the information used, or something else? Thank you. And Shawn, if you want to go ahead and go back to that slide, feel free to share your application again.
Okay, I guess I can answer that unless there's a need to show the slide. But yes, that's a great question. Those 403 vulnerability assessments were basically a response by each DOI bureau in terms of what work that they had going on that they self-identified as a vulnerability assessment. The data call itself did not include strict guidance or a strict definition of what those were. So the question is right, I guess, in terms of it represented how agencies thought they should respond, but there was a process that we had to use to go through and call them back directly and have a discussion about whether they felt it was a vulnerability assessment based on kind of our new definition. And then moving forward, as I kind of alluded to, I think it's key that when we try and ask for this kind of information in the future, that we be very forthright in terms of what we consider a vulnerability assessment, how we define those key elements of a vulnerability assessment, so that people can really, I think, provide probably better information. I'll just throw out an example that we found was very often was we saw a lot of project level work in terms of paleoclimatology work or some SLAM modeling or some habitat modeling that were really great components of a vulnerability assessment, but really didn't include the suite of elements you would expect in a comprehensive vulnerability assessment. So those types of issues were definitely present in the data call.
Thank you, Shawn. We did have a suggestion from Chris Lett to see a whole presentation on science base, and we can do a quick show of check marks to see if that is an overall interest. So everyone, would you please press the green check mark between the participant list and the chat box if you're interested in seeing that, just so we can get a quick view. I'm thinking this is a good topic.
All right. Well, that's great. We're excited to share what we've been learning.
And thank you for that suggestion, Chris. Emily, do you have any questions? I don't have any more from this end.
No, I think we're good. So ready to wrap it up?
I think that sounds great.
All right. So in conclusion, I'd just like to thank Shawn. It was a great presentation, and also to all of you that attended. We really appreciate it. This recording has been, or this webinar has been recorded, so if friends or compatriots missed it, they can look online in a week or two. The next webinar in this series will be conducted on February 27th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and that will be from Thomas Smith, who's going to be discussing conservation and management of Florida's biodiversity. And we also want to invite you to attend an upcoming webinar that is part of the National Conservation Training Center's Safeguarding Wildlife from Climate Change series. Michelle Staudinger from the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center will be conducting a presentation with Virginia Burkett on the National Climate Assessment and the technical input that Shawn discussed that was part of this assessment. So that will be held on February 6th, and you can find more information on both of those at the National Center website, which is NCCWSC.USGS.gov. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Shawn and Emily, and everybody for your participation.